17. And it fell on a day that Elisha passed to Shunem, where was a great woman, and she constrained him to eat bread. And so it was that, as oft as he passed by, he turned in thither to eat bread. And she said unto her husband, Behold, now I perceive that this is a holy man of God, which passeth by us continually. Let us make a little chamber, I pray thee, on the wall, and let us set for him there a bed, and a table, and a stool, and a candlestick. And it shall be when he cometh to us, and he shall turn in thither. And it fell on a day that he came thither, and he turned into the chamber, and lay there. And he said to Gehazi his servant, Call this Shunammite. And when he had called her, she stood before him. And he said unto him, Say now unto her, Behold, thou hast been careful for us with all this care. What is it to be done for thee? Wouldst thou be spoken for to the king, or to the captain of the host? And she answered, I dwell among mine own people. And he said, What then is to be done for her? And Gehazi answered, Verily, that hath no child, and her husband is old. And he said, Call her. And when he had called her, she stood in the door. And he said, About this season, according to the time of life, thou shalt embrace a son. And she said, Nay, my lord, thou man of God, do not lie unto thine handmaid. And the woman conceived and bare a son at that season that Elisha had said unto her, according to the time of life.
Certainly good to see you here today. If you do not have one of the outlines, if you'll raise your hand, one of those men in the back will get one to you. While that's being done, I want to remind you next Sunday afternoon, about 5:15, we will have our yearly presentation of the budget. And at that time also, some of the deacons will speak, as well as the elders, and talk about the work for the coming year. And I encourage all of you to be present. You know, one of the great blessings of being a part of anything is knowing what's going on. And of course, in the Lord's church, we know that the overall thing of what is going on is seeking and saving the lost. But there are several aspects to that work that are accomplished through the monies that you and I give, as was noted on the Lord's table, as we give liberally and cheerfully upon the first day of the week. And it behooves each of us to be aware not only of just giving and let it go, but of the work that we can be a part of. And so I hope that all of you determined to come and to be part of that meeting, you will have opportunity to ask questions of the elders concerning any aspect of the work. So it is a very important time so we can get off next year on the right foot. Make sure that everybody is focused in the same way and excited about the work that we're able to do. So set your calendars, make the plans, make whatever changes, but if at all possible, be here and be a part of that. You know, whenever you look in 2 Kings 4, there's one word that stands out there. Great. Great woman. Now you think about that, and greatness is something that so many people in the world want, they desire. You read, for example, the Pharisees in Matthew 18, you know, how they sought to see how great they were, in Matthew 23 rather, and how they sought to be called by various names, rabbi, rabbi, master, master, teacher, teacher. They even in their clothing, they tried to make themselves stand out so everybody would know just who they are. And in Matthew 18, it was a problem also amongst even the disciples of Jesus as they sought, asking who's the greatest in the kingdom. So there are people who strive for that. And that's wrong. You know, we don't want it for a renown because somebody needs to know who I am. But it is something that you look at and you see this woman in verse 8, this great woman. Now, this woman was great. That word can be used in a lot of different senses. It can be used in the sense of possessions or power. But it can also be used like it is over in the book of Exodus, the 11th chapter, whenever you find that Moses there was great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, in the sight of the people. Well, obviously you look, and there was much going on that was against Pharaoh, against the nation of Egypt at God's hand. So it wasn't greatness in the sense of him being in charge or anything else, but they were amazed at what he did, the character that he set forth as he was God's servant. And I believe that's the way it's used mainly of this woman at this time. So we hope that none of us want to be great just so somebody knows, but rather we want God to acknowledge us as great. We want God to realize that we are dedicated to Him, that we are great in the sense of valuable, important to Him in the kingdom. We don't seek the praise of men. We do seek, though, the praise of God. And that causes us then to look and examine ourselves. Sometimes it's not an easy thing. It's a whole lot easier thing to look out and to point at others and say, well, next week we're going to be looking at the budget, going to be looking at the program of work, and we could look and say, well, what are the elders going to do? What are the deacons going to do? But it ought to be, what are we going to do? How can I be a better part, a better servant of the congregation here, of the Lord and His kingdom? 2 Corinthians 13 and verse 5, examine yourselves whether you be in the faith. And that's really what we're talking about, and that's what this woman is an example of. She was a great woman, and the character that she sets forth in this account as she looks and she sees Elisha, she provides for him, she goes to him, he benefits her, she goes back questioning some of the things that happened whenever her child died. But all of these things, she sets forth a character that helps us to look and say, is that me? What would God think of me as He looked down on my life? And I hope that every one of us realizes that we can be great in God's eyes. Not because we're better than others, but because we're who we ought to be. So you look at this and you think about the Shunammite woman, and you think about her greatness. And the first thing, of course, that stands out, and this is what she is praised for so many times as you see studies about her. In verse 8 it says, it fell on a day that Elisha passed to Shunem, and there was a great woman, and she was constrained to him, or she constrained him to eat bread. And so it was that as oft as he passed by, he turned thither to eat bread. So she was a woman of hospitality. She saw the ability she had. Galatians 6 and verse 10 describes us. Galatians 6 is such an amazing chapter. As we correct those in need of corrections, we bear one another's burdens. In verse 10, he says, as you have therefore opportunity, do good unto all men, especially those of the household of faith. This is a picture of that woman. She went about doing good, and that's what Jesus is described as one in Acts the 10th chapter. And you look and you find here, this is what she was known for. In Romans the 12th chapter, you find a battle going on. In Romans 12, it begins what many people call the practical section. Not that the rest of it isn't practical, but it begins what's emphasizing more aspects of the Christian life, you might say. And in chapter 12 and verse 1 and 2, he talks about that we are to be a different type of person. We're to be transformed by the renewing of our spirit rather than conform to the world. The world says, you're on your own. You in trouble? Take care of yourself. I got me to take care of. Well, in Romans, the 12th chapter, he says, don't be that type of person. Don't be like the world. That's not my pattern. But I look and I find in verse 13 that amongst other things given, this love that's without dissimulation is a person who is distributing to the necessity of the saints, given to hospitality. That word given, now a lot of people get, their favorite aspect of use of the word given is whenever you talk about elders and deacons. Are they to be given to wine or not given to wine? So that means I can go out and I can drink socially. the technical word for that is hogwash. That's foolishness gone to seed as somebody handles the Word of God that way. We've studied that over and over. But that same word given is used here of hospitality. Addicted, pursuing, seeking after. You know, we're not to be given, let anything control us that's evil, but here this woman, it seems, was, as Paul describes the church in Rome as to who they're to be and who we're to be, this just be something that we can't help ourselves. We pursue it. I mean, this woman, she saw Elisha and she constrained him. She saw, here is a need that needs to be fulfilled. Elisha went about, and you read about the prophets, you read about all that befell them, and they were at the mercy of people in so many things physically. And so she saw this need, and she said, you've got to come eat. You ever known anybody like that? I mean, through the 35 plus years I've been here, one of the amazing things has been the women. I mean, everybody's there, but the women, they stand out because they're a little more perceptive, and we'll talk about that at times, but you look and you see she saw a need, and she just wouldn't let it go. You ever been mothered? I have for all my life, but here at this congregation, I've been mothered by a lot of women. Still goes on. Women will come up, okay, what's wrong? What's doing? What you going to need? Can I get you? Do you need to eat? I mean, all of these things, and it's just like, I'm in my house when I was growing up. I'm in my house with my wife. But that's the hospitality. That's the care, the concern for others. That's a trait that sets Christians apart, sets followers of God apart. Did in the Old Testament and here. You know, that's pure Christianity, undefiled before God and the Father, James 1 and verse 27. To visit the fatherless and the widows. That means look and see the needs, see the opportunity and the ability to help, and then do it. That's an amazing person. But that ought to be what the world sees in us. We ought to be different from the world, and not just around Christmas. I mean, you see that in, around Christmas, people that are just stingy to the gut. That around Christmas they want to give. But after Christmas, you're on your own. Done my part. Well, that's Christianity. This is a way of life. Not centered around some holiday. It's not centered around just the people that are in my favor. It is a perception of the need and a willingness to give to do it. And then also you find that there was a woman here in greatness because she had a spiritual perception. Now, notice in verse 9, it says, she saw or said unto her husband, behold, now I perceive that this is a holy man of God, which passeth by us continually. So she was perceptive. Now, we mentioned before, we're involved in a lot of benevolence from various times here in the congregation. The deacons do a large part, and then there are individuals who do a lot on their own. But you look, and one of the things, you might go out sometimes after services, and by the way, if somebody does need help, the deacons do not interrupt their worship of God to deal with people. They say, we will talk with you after services. But you might walk out and see the door to the room in the back closed, and sometimes it's to keep the little hands out. But other times it's because there are men in there who are trying to perceive about this need. Whether it is a need that is there, whether it is something that will glorify God in benefiting this. This woman looked, she saw Elisha, and she was willing to help him, willing to understand what was going on. You find that she did compel him, constrain him, come eat, let's do this, let's look at this. And then she perceived that he was a holy man of God. And she went further then. We need to look and realize, 2 John 9 through 11, that's why the deacons will look and why we will look. And somebody, I want money. I don't give anybody money, by the way. If it is something, and The congregation here, the deacons, one of the things they're told, you don't give anybody money. If it is a worthy thing and bills need to be paid, we pay the bills directly. You don't give money to anybody. Why is that? Sadly, in this world, there's a lot of people that owe money to different situations because they use money on evil things. We're not going to support that. I'm not individually, we're not as a congregation going to support somebody's drug or any other evil habit. But whenever you perceive what type of person it is, you've done what God said. 2 John 9 through 11, somebody doesn't bring the doctrine of Christ, somebody is a promoter of evil, you don't help them. And that's caused some problems in times past. The deacons have to say, okay, this is the way it is, go on. But you need to have a spiritual perception. I don't want to support evil, but the reverse is true. Whenever I look and I see in 2 John 9 through 11, you don't bid evil Godspeed, but you do whenever you support good. Just like you can be a partaker of evil deeds, you're a partaker of good deeds. Do you realize this Shunammite woman, because of her spiritual perception, as she did what we ought to do, 1 Thessalonians 5:21, prove all things, hold fast that which is good, that she became a partaker of the work of Elisha? Do you realize that she was benefiting that work, that worker? And God looked at her as promoting that work? You go in the New Testament and you find Paul, as he talks about one who oft refreshed his soul. I mean, you find so many instances of individuals who have this spiritual perception. They want to do good. There are limits to what we can go out and do. This woman said, here is this man. He's a holy man of God that passes by us continually. He's going about doing God's work. What am I going to do? Because I perceive that I'm going to be more involved in the work. We need to have a spiritual perception like this great woman of Shunem. And then also you find that she was a great woman because of her willingness to sacrifice. Notice in verse 10, she went to her husband and said, let us make a little chamber, I pray thee, on the wall. Let us set for him there a bed, a table, a stool, a candlestick, and it shall be, when he cometh to us, that he shall turn in thither. In other words, she not only was willing to provide the food, but now she said to her husband, she said, let's build him a room. And so the picture is, they built a place for him to come. Whenever he traveled by, he could go in and there was a place with a bed, a stool where he could sit, a candlestick. All of these things are there so that he would have the comforts that are needed. The blessing was given by her and her husband of a willingness to sacrifice to do that. It's easy. I don't know how much labor had to go into this or whatever, whether it was a financial aspect or whether they themselves built, whatever it may be. But doing such things, that's not easy. It's easy to look and say, well, I'll give on the first day of the week. I'm done. Well, in essence, she did that whenever she constrained him to come in and eat. But then she went further. She said, I'm going to involve myself more in this. I'm willing to put self, effort, all of the requirements of providing this. Her and her husband were willing to do that. So she had a willingness to sacrifice. Whenever David was to offer a sacrifice unto God, and he was there and he offered to buy the threshing floor, and he was told, I'll give it to you. And he said, I'll not offer unto my Lord that which cost me nothing. Sometimes people look, well, what does that have to do with me? Because you're talking about offering to other people, not to the Lord. Better reread Matthew 25. The judgment day. Whenever some were told to part, some were told to enter in. Well, why the difference? Because I was a hungered, I was athirst, I needed clothes, I was in prison, and you visited me. And those who were cast away said, Lord, when did we see you athirst or hungered or in prison? He said, in that you've done it the least of these, you've done it unto me. You see, whenever I am this type of person, I am as if I do it unto the Lord. A lot of times we forget that. A lot of times we look and say, I can treat other people out here. I can sacrifice for God. And I'm not going to do anything for you. You just lost sacrificing for God because you're not doing it. You have that attitude, that characteristic of hospitality. You have that spiritual perception. You want to promote. You want to help good. And you realize that whenever you do that, you're willing to sacrifice. And whenever you sacrifice, it's just like you were sacrificing to do it to the Lord. This woman is an amazing example of that life. And then also you find she's a great woman in her contentment. Now, you notice in verse 12 and 13, he said to Gehazi, his servant, call this Shunammite. And when he had called her, she stood before him. And he said, say now unto her, behold, thou hast been careful for us with all this care. What is to be done for thee? Wouldst thou be spoken for to the king or to the captain of the host? In other words, I can advance you. Maybe it was going to get her a place to where she could move to where the king was. Maybe she could get the blessings of that. Maybe she could be raised. I'm not sure. We don't know her name even. We don't know what she did necessarily. But maybe whatever she did, her and her husband, they could prosper more. What was her response? You look at that, and whenever she said that, she answered and said, I dwell amongst my own people. I'm fine where I am. You ever had that attitude? Come on, let me help you. Hey, I'm okay. Now, there are times, whenever people aren't okay, and because of really maybe a matter of pride or misplaced pride, that they don't want any help. That isn't the case of this woman, it doesn't seem. She could have gone from where she was maybe to a higher plane, because here's Elisha going to speak to the king for, captain of the host. He said, I'm fine. I dwell amongst my people. I'm fine where I am and how I'm doing. Contentment is something that's so hard to come by in this room. In 1 Timothy 6, I said this room because we can talk about the world, but let's talk about us. How many of us have learned contentment? 1 Timothy 6, Paul talks about those who would strive to be rich. Nothing wrong with money. But if it overshadows the things of God, we're in trouble. And so he says, godliness with contentment is great gain. We need to look beyond what is now and look to what will come. We need to focus on the things beyond. Last night I had another discussion. I've got a granddaughter that is just growing up, and she brings up things that kind of shocks me. And just talking about eat, drink, and be merry. She said the Bible talks about that. So we talked about the Epicurean attitude. That eat, drink, and be merry, but tomorrow you die. And we discussed how that those kind of people, they don't look at what's to come. It's just right now. What can I do? And so sometimes we get that way. We're never content. And that's the attitude that brings, well, I'm going to get involved in the work of the Lord one day. But right now, I'm in school. And of course, after I get out of school, the challenge is made. Let's get involved in the work of the Lord. Let's all do what we can. That's all God expects. You may be a one-talent person, you may be a five-talent person, but use what you got. Well, I'm going to do that. But right now, I'm getting into the workplace. And you get the job. Okay, let's get involved in, I got married. So I'm working on my family. And I'm building up my career, and I've got to do that to support my family. And so I really can't do anything now, but And on it goes until retirement. And you say, okay, let's get involved in the work. I've done my part. It's time for the younger group to do it. And what has been done? Nothing. Why? Because I never was content. Now, am I saying that you shouldn't be involved in education, you shouldn't be involved in your family, shouldn't be involved in your work, shouldn't be involved in laying up money to the extent that you can provide your family if you need be? A lot of people can't even do that, but you keep your head above water and then the time. No. But you know what? God understood every aspect of our lives whenever He said, grow not weary in well-doing. I may not be able to do what others do, but all God asks is to do what you can. And how many times, let's be honest, how many times you say, well, I can't do that. But then they ask you to work a little more. Well, yeah, I can do that. They tell you you need to do this, or your child adds this other activity, or you have this opportunity to do something with your husband or your wife to go out here. I can do all of that, but I don't have, look, I'm too busy for the things of the Lord. But one of these days, there's no contentment there. It's always later. This woman, she said, I dwell amongst my own people. I'm okay where I am. Now, she was blessed beyond that. I mean, she desired a child, and she didn't ever think it would happen, but she was given that. Sometimes we're blessed beyond measure, but this woman, she still seemed to be a content person. And sometimes the more we taste of what is a blessing, the more we want, and the more we're willing to sacrifice the things that God says ought to be godliness in our lives. So this woman, she was great in her contentment. She, like the Apostle Paul, had learned in whatsoever state she was therewith to be content. Much like Job. Job looked and he suffered loss as this woman is about to. And in all of those things, even his own wife, and by the way, here's another spiritual perception. It seems he married right. Her husband was with her on this. But in all of these things, she suffered all of this. Well, Job's wife said, Job, why do you retain your integrity? Curse God and die. Ever had a spouse like that? I know people who have. Don't let that religion, look, we're married. Forget this religious stuff. You can only have a little bit. You can't do that. If you love me, do you love me? What are you doing with this religion stuff? We need time for ourselves. All these things come in. You married right. By the way, sometimes you might marry wrong. I know somebody who did. Paul's mother. But the faith that was in her, because and as you were able, this woman did that. She was a woman with contentment. And then she was great in her faith. Now you go on down from verse 17 where the child was born. And then when the child was grown, fell on a day, his father was gone out to the reapers, and the child said, my head, my head. He took her to the mother. Another great thing, you get into parenting. How many kids, whenever they get hurt, do you hear them cry out, Daddy, Daddy? They cry out, Mama, Mama. He knew this one, though he was grown, needed his mama. She took that child and he lay in her lap and he died. And this woman, she shows such an amazing faith. She goes to her husband and tells him and said, I'm going to Elisha. He said, go and find me a servant, get somebody to ride with me. So she was going to go to Elijah, and he said, well, he didn't understand. It's not the new moon, the Sabbath. That's when you normally go. But she said, it's well. In other words, it's going to be okay. First indication of faith. Lost your child. It's going to be okay. So she goes, and whenever she comes to the man of God, Elisha says, go and ask her, is it well with thee? Is it well with thy husband? Is it well with thy child? She said, it is well. And she ran to him. She'd lost her child. Well, it's going to be okay. I thank God. I have never lost a child. I pray I never will. People say that it ought never be where you outlive your children or your grandchildren. I pray I will never come to confront the reality of that statement. But I've known people who have. I've seen two types of people. I've seen people that make me marvel, like this woman. Well, it's going to be okay. I'm at a loss. What do you say to a person like that? You hug them, and all the time you're saying to yourself, Lord, let me have the faith of this person in the struggles that I face. I've seen other people that leave the Lord. They're like Job's wife. Just forget God. Curse God. I've seen both. But I marvel at this woman, and I marvel at the people I know that have come through that and said, well, it's going to be okay. You look at the book of Romans, the 8th chapter, verse 28. All things work together for good to them that love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. Doesn't say everything's good. Paul never said everything's just going to be fine, bed of roses, nothing's going to happen. He said if you've got a bed of roses, they're filled with thorns, and you're going to feel them from time to time. But it's going to be okay. Everything's going to work out. That is the faith that this woman had. And in all of that, she showed a persistence. Remember in the beginning, she perceived that this was a holy man of God. Whenever this trial came, where did she run? She didn't run away from God. She ran to her connection with God. She ran to know where it would be. And whenever Gehazi saw her run and leap and grab it, he tried to pull her away, and she said no. Whenever Elisha was going to send Gehazi back, and he sent him and said, you take this rod, and you take it and you lay it upon the child. And the woman said, I'm not leaving without you, Elisha. How many people in times of turmoil or strife or struggle turn away from God? This woman was more determined. She said, Elisha, I know who you are. I know you promised me this child. I know that I seek God through you. I'm not going anywhere without you. John 14 and verse 6, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, the life. Paul, I talked about him, Philippians 4. Whatsoever state I am, I've learned therewith to be content. How'd you do that, Paul? Verse 13, I can do all things through Christ. The more struggles that came upon Paul, the closer he drew. He knew where the answer, he knew where the hope was. This woman didn't know whether that child would be brought back to life. She wanted to make sure that the promise to her, she understood it. She wasn't promised for a certain length of time. The child had been born, he had grown, and it seems he was an adult at this time, but the child is gone. She went and she said, I told you not to lie to me. He could have said, you had the child. She wanted to make sure. You ever made sure of your faith? Times of struggle, you got a choice. I've got a choice. I can flounder, I can walk away, I can get mad, I can get puffed up, or I can go to God and I can search the Scriptures and I can look and say, God, you said it, I believe it, it is well. The world looks and says, what do you mean it's well? Do you realize what you're going through? Yes, I do. It is well. No matter what, I know that all things are going to work together for good. This woman, and there's so much more could be said, but you look back, this woman is an example. Romans 15:4, these are written that we can have comfort. See, if you don't find comfort in the life of this woman and knowing what we can do, who we can be, I don't know what to say. But then learn too, Philippians